On the morning of April 19, 1942, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato anchored at Hashirajima and read the dispatch from Tokyo with undisguised contempt. American bombers had struck the capital the previous day. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, had somehow appeared over Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. The damage was negligible. A few buildings destroyed, perhaps 50 civilians killed, some minor industrial disruption. Ugaki crumpled the message and turned to his staff. "A propaganda stunt," he declared. "Nothing more than Roosevelt's desperate attempt to boost American morale after 5 months of defeat." Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, was less dismissive, but equally miscalculated the raid's significance. In his cabin that evening, he wrote to Vice Admiral Nagumo that the attack merely confirmed what they already knew. The Americans were reckless and would waste their limited resources on symbolic gestures rather than strategic objectives. The fact that no American carriers had been spotted meant the bombers must have launched from Chinese airfields, he reasoned, making this a one-time propaganda effort of no military consequence. At Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the response was similarly muted. Army Chief of Staff General Hajime Sugiyama briefed Emperor Hirohito that morning, emphasizing that the raid had caused less damage than a typical training accident. The bombers had clearly been modified for extreme range, stripping them of defensive armament, which explained why 9 of the 16 had been reported shot down, though in reality, none had been. The general assured the emperor that the homeland's air defenses merely needed minor adjustments, perhaps a few more fighter squadrons retained from the southern operations. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack 4 months earlier, was recuperating from appendicitis at Yokosuka Naval Hospital when the sirens wailed over Tokyo. From his window, he watched anti-aircraft fire burst harmlessly in clear sky, while B-25s droned overhead at 1,500 feet, unmolested by fighters. He immediately recognized the implications that his superiors missed. These were not modified long-range bombers from China. They were carrier-launched, medium bombers doing what every Japanese naval aviator had been taught was impossible. When he tried to express his concerns to visiting staff officers that afternoon, they dismissed him as delirious from medication. The Japanese Navy's intelligence section spent 3 days analyzing the raid's trajectory and timing. Commander Yoshitaka Mio presented his findings to the Naval General Staff on April 21st. The bombers had definitely launched from carriers, probably the Enterprise and Hornet, from a position approximately 650 nautical miles east of Tokyo. This meant the American carriers had penetrated deep into waters the Japanese considered absolutely secure. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, rejected the analysis. "Impossible," he stated flatly. "B-25s cannot launch from carriers. Your calculations must be wrong." But Mio was not wrong. The USS Hornet, with 16 B-25s lashed to her deck and accompanied by the Enterprise, had indeed launched the raid from 650 miles out after being spotted by the Japanese picket boat Nitomaru. The premature launch, they had planned to close to 450 miles, meant the bombers would never reach their intended Chinese airfields, but Doolittle had pressed ahead anyway. What the Japanese interpreted as American incompetence was actually American audacity. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, Yamamoto's staff began planning the next phase of operations without adjusting for the raid's implications. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's senior operations officer, had already drafted plans for the seizure of Midway Island, intended to draw out and destroy the American carrier fleet. The Doolittle Raid, rather than accelerating these plans, was seen as vindication of their necessity. "Once we destroy their carriers at Midway," Kuroshima told the planning staff, Such pin-prick raids will become impossible. The Japanese Army's response was more concerned with face than strategy. General Sugiyama ordered the execution of 8 captured Doolittle raiders as war criminals for allegedly bombing civilian targets. Though the Americans had specifically targeted military and industrial facilities. He also launched the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, deploying 53 infantry battalions and 16 artillery battalions to destroy Chinese airfields that might support future raids. Over the next 4 months, Japanese troops would kill an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians in retaliation for Chinese assistance to the downed American air crews, a massive diversion of resources that accomplished nothing strategically. Meanwhile, intercepted American radio traffic suggested something the Japanese missed entirely. Naval intelligence at Owata picked up increasing references to target folders, bombing objectives, and industrial priorities in coded American transmissions. Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omae, one of the few intelligence officers who suspected the raid's true significance, tried to warn his superiors that the Americans were planning sustained bombing operations. His report was filed without action. The Doolittle Raid, his superiors assured him, was clearly a one-time morale booster. Admiral Yamamoto's miscalculation became apparent in a staff meeting on April 25th. When Commander Yasuji Watanabe suggested strengthening homeland air defenses by retaining 2 additional fighter groups from the southern operations, Yamamoto dismissed the idea. 16 bombers that caused minimal damage do not warrant altering our entire strategic deployment, he said. The Americans have shot their bolt. They will not risk their precious carriers again for such minimal returns. This assessment might have been correct if the raid had been what the Japanese thought it was, a desperate propaganda gesture by a failing power. But the Doolittle Raid was actually a probe, a test of Japanese defenses and reactions, and most importantly, a psychological operation that succeeded beyond American expectations. The Japanese High Command's dismissive response told American planners exactly what they needed to know. Japan's leadership suffered from victory disease, underestimating American resolve and overestimating their own invulnerability. By early May, consequences began cascading from the miscalculation. The Japanese Navy, confident that homeland waters were secure, allocated minimal reconnaissance assets to the approaches to Japan. The submarine picket lines that might have detected future American operations were instead deployed to support the Midway operation. Fighter squadrons that could have provided homeland defense were committed to Rabaul and the Solomons. Most critically, the Japanese accelerated the Midway operation timeline without adequate preparation, convinced they needed to eliminate the American carriers before another propaganda raid could embarrass the Navy. Admiral Ugaki, who had so contemptuously dismissed the initial reports, began to sense something was wrong by May 10th. Intelligence reports indicated massive American naval construction programs, new airfields being rushed to completion across the Pacific, and most troublingly, repeated references in intercepted communications to Tokyo and homeland targets. When he brought these concerns to Yamamoto, the admiral remained fixed on Midway. After we sink their carriers, Yamamoto assured him, it will not matter what they plan. The American response developed exactly as the Japanese had failed to anticipate. Admiral Ernest King and General Henry Arnold immediately began planning for sustained bombing operations against Japan. The Doolittle Raid had proven that Japan's homeland was vulnerable, that their early warning systems were inadequate, and most importantly, that Japanese leadership would rationalize away warnings rather than adapt to new threats. Within weeks of the raid, American industrial priorities shifted toward long-range bomber production, specifically the B-29 Superfortress, which would not need carriers to reach Japan. Captain Fuchida, finally released from the hospital in early May, tried one more time to warn his superiors. In a report to Admiral Nagumo, he wrote that the Doolittle Raid represented the first drops of a coming thunderstorm. The Americans had demonstrated they would accept extreme risks and one-way missions to strike Japan. This was not the behavior of a demoralized enemy, but of a determined one. Nagumo forwarded the report to Yamamoto with a dismissive note: "Fuchida remains affected by his illness." The critical failure came in Japanese intelligence assessment. Commander Miyo, whose analysis of the raid's carrier origins had been rejected, watched as his section's warnings were repeatedly ignored. American submarine activity near Japan increased dramatically in May. Radio intercepts suggested multiple carrier task forces operating in the Central Pacific. New American aircraft types were being rushed to forward bases. All indicators pointed to sustained offensive operations, not isolated propaganda stunts. Yet when Miyo presented this analysis on May 15th, Admiral Nagano's response was telling: "You are seeing patterns where none exist. The Americans used their one trick. They have nothing left." On June 4, 1942, at Midway, the Japanese Navy would discover how wrong they were. 4 Japanese carriers would burn and sink, victims of American dive bombers launched from the carriers. Japanese leadership was certain would never again risk approaching Japanese-controlled waters. The American victory at Midway was built on many factors, but one was crucial. Japanese high command had interpreted the Doolittle Raid as American weakness rather than American strength. Admiral Yamamoto would later tell his chief of staff that the Doolittle Raid should have warned them, not because of the minimal damage it caused, but because it revealed American determination to carry the war to Japan regardless of cost. The Americans had launched Army bombers from Navy carriers, an improvisation so unlikely that Japanese military doctrine had never considered it. If they would do that for a propaganda raid, what else would they attempt? By August 1942, as American Marines stormed ashore at Guadalcanal, the answer was becoming clear. The Doolittle Raid had not been a desperate gesture, but an announcement. The Japanese had dismissed it as meaningless, interpreting its limited damage as evidence of American impotence. They failed to recognize it for what it was: a statement of intent by an enemy who would spend the next 3 years proving that April 18, 1942, had indeed been just the beginning. The final irony came in a recovered diary entry from Admiral Ugaki, written in March 1945 as B-29 superfortresses reduced Tokyo to ashes in firestorms that killed more than 100,000 civilians in a single night. "The Doolittle Raid," he wrote, "was not the meaningless gesture we thought. It was a knock on the door. We refused to answer, so the Americans kicked it down.